Hello and welcome to our second episode of the Good Book Club, where we are recapping and previewing the readings assigned through the season of Lent and Easter in the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. This is the second video in this series. If you missed the first one or you need a recap, you can go to our website, christchurchnewbern.com, and click on the News tab, and you'll be able to see last week's video where we did a little introduction to the Gospel of Luke, as well as talking about what the Good Book Club is all about. So glad you're with us on this episode, and as always, if you have any questions or thoughts you want to share, please do so either on our website where the video is posted, or on our Vimeo page where the video is also posted, or you can email me at paulkennedy@christchurchnewbern.com. It's never too late to join us in this journey. So if you want to just pick up where we're talking about this week and read through chapters 5, 6, and 7, please jump on in. And then we're starting on chapter 8 today. Chapters 8 through 11 will take us through next Sunday. So feel free to join us there, or if you want to go back to the very beginning and start at Luke chapter 1 and catch up, you are more than welcome to do that too. So without any further ado, let us recap chapters 5, 6, and 7. And again, we'll have a little preview of chapters 8 through 11 also. So last week, in last week's video at the end, I talked about a few things to look for in chapters 5, 6, and 7. In particular, I wanted you to look at who Jesus butted heads with, and not just who, but why. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. I also encouraged you in chapters 5, 6, and 7 to look at the various ways Jesus offered healing to people. So it's an important motif throughout Luke's gospel, and so one that is particularly highlighted in these three chapters. At least that's our first taste of that, and so I want to encourage you. I encourage you to read those chapters with those particular questions in mind. So in chapter 5, Jesus heals two people in two very different ways. The first is a man with a skin disease. And he says to Jesus, "If you want, you can make me well." He approaches Jesus, and Jesus says, I do want to make you well. And he reaches out and he touches him. Something that was probably, we can go back and forth on whether that was a taboo thing to do, to touch someone with a skin disease, but because it would have made Jesus ritually unclean. But the downside to that, or the flip side to that rather, is that there were so many things that made you ritually unclean that there were ways to remedy that all the time. So, but the important part in this first healing is that Jesus reaches out and touches the person. The person asks to be made well, and Jesus reaches out and touches that person to make them well. Now, just a few verses later, we have one of the more powerful images to me in all of the New Testament, which is the healing of the man whose friends lowered him through the roof. The crowd was so great in this particular house that they couldn't get him in. He was on a mat. I imagine some sort of like throw rug or something that they were carrying him in on, and they couldn't get in through the crowd, so they went up to the roof. And if you read the difference between Luke's gospel and Mark's gospel, where this story also is, in Mark's gospel, I think it's something like a thatched roof or a mud roof. This one actually referred to tiles. So there's a little bit of an upgrade to the house in Luke's version of the story. But nonetheless, Jesus heals this person first by forgiving his sins, which was, I think, Jesus a little bit just poking the bear at the Pharisees and other people who were around. But also simply by speaking to him and saying, "Get up, take your mat, and walk." But what is most remarkable to me in this particular story is the guy who is healed says absolutely nothing. He says he has no dialogue. He doesn't ask to be made well. He doesn't thank Jesus. None of that. It is the faith of the man's friends who bring him healing. It is not his own faith or his own belief that Jesus can do this. It is the faith of his friends. Now, in both cases, though, the one being healed is present for the miracle that we see happen. Now, we go through chapter 6, and there's really no healing miracles in chapter 6. So we get to chapter 7, and we have the story of the Roman centurion whose servant is very ill. And this particular centurion, even though he was a Roman, he was very well respected in this village. The village elders note that he built the synagogue for the village. So he certainly, there seemed to be a mutual admiration society going on there. And so we can read some good stuff into that as well. There's no indication that Jesus wasn't going to heal the centurion's servant. Jesus doesn't seem to raise any questions about healing this person. He doesn't know whether or not the servant is a Jew or a Gentile. It doesn't seem to matter in this. Certainly the person who is asking is not Jewish by all accounts, if he's a Roman centurion. He could have been what was known as a God-fearer, which were Gentiles who lived within the Torah, lived within the law, but were not full-fledged Jews, especially not by birth. They weren't Jews, but they adhered to a lot of Jewish customs. But we don't know that. So there's some inferring that could happen, some speculating, but again, we don't know that. But nonetheless, it's the faith of the centurion, not anybody else. It's the faith of the centurion that allows this individual to be healed, and is what most impresses Jesus as well. There's two things about this particular scene I want to highlight. The first is that Jesus and the centurion never meet face to face. The centurion has sent some emissaries out ahead of him to go and to deliver this message to Jesus and to sort of promote the guy. The guy is saying, this is how important I am, and I get it, but you're more important. You have more power than me, a centurion. So that's a pretty impressive scene. And that Jesus never makes it to the centurion's house, right? The centurion sends his messengers, they talk. Jesus proclaims the guy's faith, and then this is point number 2, Jesus never actually says your servant is healed or the servant will be made well. Jesus just says, I've never seen faith like this before. And at that same moment, Luke tells us that the centurion's servant is made well. So it is the faith of the guard of this Roman centurion that is actually what brings the servant healing. So that's a very different healing scenario than the first two we talked about. Again, where the first two, the person who is healed is actually present, and then in this one, the person is not present. But again, it's the faith of someone else and not just the faith of the sick person that makes all of that possible. So finally, in this section for healing miracles, Jesus raises a dead man. Raises back to life someone who was dead. He's the only child of a widow, and so in Jesus' time, the widow would have been potentially very destitute. So there was great sadness. Jesus calls him a young man, but we don't know how old he is. But it is a healing scene that brings a lot of other taboo kind of things. Jesus reaches out and reaches up for the dead body, touches the stretcher, but doesn't touch the body itself. And he just simply says, I say to you, get up. We'd have to really pause and look to realize that nobody asked Jesus to do this either. Jesus sees this particular scene and he sees the widow crying and he says, take a deep breath, we're going to make it all right. And he says, young man, I say to you, get up. And he helps him down from the stretcher and restores this person to life and potentially even restores the widow to wholeness as well and all of that. So We believe that Luke was a physician in his time. We believe that for a couple of reasons. One is there are so many healing stories in Luke, and also because of the vocabulary that Luke used was associated with someone with a grand education, so someone who was a doctor. There are so many healing scenes in here, but each one of them is done from a different perspective, and each one brings a different meaning to Jesus' ministry. The depth and the breadth of all of these shows how many different ways, this is the way I read into it, how many different ways Jesus meets us where we are. How we can encounter Jesus from where we need to be, from where we are, versus Jesus saying to anyone in these stories, you do this and I'll do that. Jesus sees some of these people and he heals them, he makes them whole. The first person is the only one who says, you can make me well if you want to. And Jesus certainly says, I do want to. But in all of the other stories, Jesus restores people to life where they are, not expecting anything from that in return. So I think that really tells a story to us that Jesus can work with us no matter what shape we are in, if we will allow Jesus to do that. So that's a good bit about healing. We've talked a little bit about that. Now let's talk about who Jesus butted heads with, and more importantly, why. The Pharisees is always the right answer, right, in this, or at least a really good answer if you're ever on Jeopardy or some other game show, and the question is, who did Jesus butt heads with? The Pharisees. But the question is why, and there's a couple of thoughts on that. One of the thoughts is that the Pharisees were really just a foil in Luke's writing. So they are always the bad guy to Luke's good guy. They are the ones who help bring out the best in Jesus, help give Jesus a platform to be able to say what he's doing and why he's doing it versus doing what he does and then just talking. So giving Jesus somebody to sort of get riled up for Jesus to be able to counter with what he's all about. Now, the Pharisees believed that the law, the Torah, could be interpreted to uncover God's opinions on a wide variety of things that were not specifically covered in the law. So it's as much about the spirit of the law as it is the letter of the law. The Pharisees had some very strict readings of that, some pretty strict interpretations of that, whereas Jesus seems to demonstrate much wider grace and love. Now, that's not always true, right? Jesus comes in with some pretty strict stuff as well. We'll I think at the end of next week, we'll be looking at his little snippet of a teaching on divorce, which he goes the opposite direction, where the Pharisees had some wide latitude in that, and Jesus says, not so much, right? So Jesus had a much wider grace and love in the law, but their headbutting doesn't stop Jesus from having dinner with them in Luke's gospel on at least 3 occasions, including at the end of chapter 7, where another great scandal occurs, right, with the woman who is washing Jesus's feet at the end, and Jesus actually says to her, your faith has saved you. So maybe there's a healing, maybe not of the body, but certainly a healing of the soul in that for that woman. So it's a very powerful image, and it happens right there in front and at a dinner party that a Pharisee hosted and put Jesus at a pretty high seat of honor. So it's a great story as well. So if you're reading along, we start on chapters 8, 9, 10, and 11 this week. It's 4 chapters, but they've divided these out to be pretty even across the weeks. And so it's no more or less verses than it was the first 2 weeks. So don't let 4 chapters versus 3 chapters intimidate you. These are some great chapters as well, and a few things to look for as you're reading through chapters 8, 9, 10, and 11. The first one is, what do we learn about Jesus' ministry in these chapters beyond just the stories of healing and teaching? There's right at the beginning of chapter 8, there's an important clue about Jesus' ministry and how that is operating and how that is functioning. The other question is, how is his ministry and mission shifting? So as we get into chapter 8, we're about a third of the way through the Gospel of Luke. And so the story begins to shift, right? It's not just going to continue, right? The Jesus movement doesn't continue on one particular trajectory. There has to be some shifts and some bends in the road. And we don't always know where those bends and twists are going to occur, but we put our faith in God that God will be with us on that journey and be around the next bend with us as well. So in Jesus' ministry, as we see it in the Gospel of Luke, we see some shifts and some bends here in this section in 8, 9, 10, and 11. And so I would encourage you to read with that in mind as well. So that's about it for today. As always, if you have any questions, leave a comment on the video, on our Vimeo page or on our website. You can also shoot me an email at paulkannedy@christchurchnewbern.com. It's right here at the bottom of the screen. You can see that and send me a quick email. I would love to hear from you. Love to hear how this video is working for you and what you're learning and how and if anything you're applying anything to your life or sharing it with your friends or where you are with it. So have a fabulous day. Have a fabulous week. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord.